Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 5, Types of War, Conventional War, Limited War, and Nuclear War. And this lecture we are going to discuss nuclear war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been, as of today, the only instances when nuclear weapons were actually used in war. They were used at a time when the Americans had a monopoly of such weapons. The Soviets were to develop their first nuclear weapon in 1949, followed by the British in 1952, then the France in 1960, and the Chinese in 1964. Of recent countries that entered openly this nuclear weapons club are India and Pakistan in 1998. Today, Israel and North Korea are suspect of having nuclear weapons, and some other countries like Iran of aspiring for them. While atomic weapons have not been used since the end of the Second World War, there has been a significant improvement in their design, their destructive power, and their sophistication of design. Given the phenomenal destructive capability of such weapons, if used by the warring countries, and a realization that any conceived nuclear war would only end up destroying both the warring countries along with a general destruction elsewhere. Strategic thinking about the nuclear war has revolved around their non use rather than their use. Earlier theories of deterrence and brinkmanship have evolved into sophisticated arguments on how to avoid a nuclear confrontation. This section on nuclear war focuses on the evolution of nuclear strategy with special reference to American and Soviet strategies, wherein nuclear strategy is really a study of the known use of nuclear weapons. Now we are going to discuss strategies of nuclear war. What are the various strategies that can be used to either fight or deter a nuclear war? The following strategies have been identified for this purpose. The first one is minimum deterrence, second, credible first strike, and the third, assured destruction. The last strategy has various versions to it that depend on the capability of a nation. The strategy of minimum deterrence implies that a small strategic nuclear force is to be used to attack the enemy population centers. The purpose of this attack is to convince the enemy that if the enemy commits the first strike, retaliating force would be used. This implies that a country must have a capability to strike back if attacked in a first strike. This capability means that the nation must be able to absorb the first strike and survive to be able to strike back in retaliation. This retaliatory capability is the key to the creation of a minimum deterrence situation. The capability of first strike calls for a large strategic force that will be able to inflict a significant damage on the enemy in the first attack itself. The country must be able to destroy most of the strategic forces of the enemy in its first strike. The utility of the first strike is to convey to the enemy that any grave provocation would lead to such a strike that would destroy the strategic forces of the enemy. The next is assured destruction strategy. It is based on the assumption that if the enemy makes a first strike attack, one must have the ability to absorb the strike and conduct a retaliatory strike that would destroy the enemy's society. This retaliatory strike is not a minimal strike, as mentioned above, but a large scale strategic attack. In other words, it is the ability to absorb a surprise attack and survive with sufficient power to inflict unacceptable damage on the aggressor. The US believed that the vague threats of the possibility of use of nuclear weapons had finally ended the Korean War and brought the Chinese to the negotiation table. President Eisenhower later had sought the use of deterrence strategy to tackle the problem of security. In 1954, John Foster Dulles of the United States spelled out his doctrine of massive retaliation. The goal of this strategy was to maximize deterrence at bearable cost. The argument had been that the local defenses need to be reinforced by the fullest deterrent of massive retaliation so that the potential aggressor cannot choose the place of aggression. Thus, in the event of another proxy war like Korean, the United States would retaliate with the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviets or the Chinese. But the doctrine of massive retaliation had its critics. The most important criticism came from the European, who questioned the credibility of this threat that the United States was posing to the Soviets. Would the Americans risk an all out nuclear war if a local conflict did start in the European sector? This rethinking was to result in the revision of the original doctrine. Robert McNamara did this revision in his strategy of assured destruction, damage limitation, and flexible response. The concept of massive retaliation had but limited options, but McNamara argued that it was necessary to plan strikes against various other assets and not strike the cities as the massive retaliation had planned for. There was also the need to look for a flexible response to the initial attack. Such a flexible response would involve a conventional and a nuclear retaliatory strike and not simply a massive retaliation against any suspected aggression. Given the fact that Both the Americans and the Soviets had second strike capability. This strategy of assured destruction was spelled out by 1970s. The Americans also conceded that they no longer possessed superiority over the Soviets in the nuclear field. Thus became the starting point of discussions on limiting nuclear wars, and the dialogue culminated in the strategic arms limitation talks (SALT). The Soviet nuclear doctrine and strategy had four basic components to it. First, the general balance of political, economic, and military power and socio-psychological characteristics of the society and population are to be considered as important determinants of strategy. This is based on the ideological basis of Soviet policy. Soviet understanding of socialism as interpreted by Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, or Brezhnev would be material in understanding how strategy is crafted. Second, military doctrine and strategy had certain important tenets. The Soviets believed that the war between the US-led NATO forces and the Soviet-led Warsaw forces would be a third and decisive war between the socialists and the imperialists. It would be the just war for Soviets. The Soviets would not initiate it or indulge in a surprise attack. At the same time, revolutionary movements and other just wars would continue to gain Soviet support. Soviets had the capability of deterrence, but war is not considered as evitable. Especially Khrushchev's argument of peaceful coexistence had changed the Soviet perspective about the inevitability of war. To Khrushchev, given the nuclear scenario in the world, any war would be mutually destructive. He had argued in favor of the two systems coexisting peacefully with each other. This, however, did not rule out the Soviet needs to continue to work for the spread of socialism, and towards that goal use the benefits of strategy. The Soviets argued that the war was likely to begin with a surprise attack on the Soviet Union and not result in a protracted conflict. Soviets would go for a preemptive strike only if there is a clear warning of the NATO strike, or the Soviets could rely on their second strike capability. The targets would remain military centers or communication bases, and not population centers. Given the nuclear threat, the Soviets would continue to prepare for a qualitative and quantitative superiority in nuclear weapons. The fourth, in terms of military balance, the Soviet objective had always been superiority, both qualitative and quantitative. It is only with SALT dialogue that the Soviets were willing to give up the position of superiority vis-a-vis the US. The basic difference between the American and Soviet perception of nuclear war and the doctrine were on the definition of what constituted victory. To the Soviets, the victory encompassed the military, the political, and economic objectives. It stood for limiting the damage to the Soviet Union, defeat the NATO or United States, and dominate the post war world. American perception of victory had more of status quo overtones. It sought to retain the global balance as it was, with an inherent American superiority, and work for global order through the policy of deterrence. In a widely publicized speech in 1983, American President Ronald Reagan questioned, would it not be better to save lives than to avenge them? He called for a long term research program that would lead the United States to a goal of eliminating the threat posed by offensive strategic nuclear weapons. Since the time Soviets had become nuclear, both the US and the Soviet Union had been vulnerable to nuclear attack. The logic of first strike and of the capability of second strike had ensured that stability is achieved through deterrence. Now the American plan to devise means of defense against a possible missile attack from Soviet Union by creating a high-tech space-based defense capability based on entirely new technologies, by asking the scientific community to provide the means of rendering the attacking nuclear missile obsolete. Reagan was, in fact, questioning the very basis of deterrence as a security strategy in the nuclear age. The new American argument was that deterrence based on the ability to defend rather than retaliate with a predictable devastation of the enemy was a better option. This research program had come to be called the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), otherwise called as the Star War Program. SDI was a research program that was to investigate the feasibility of new defensive technology based in space. The new technologies aimed to detect, track, and destroy the Soviet missiles. The detection would be done from the point of its takeoff. The tracking would be continued throughout its flight path, and the destruction of the attacking missile would be done anytime from its takeoff until its last stage of zeroing onto the target. This entire mechanism was to be achieved through space-based detection system, and the weapons to do this would be non-nuclear, including laser beams, high-energy particle beams, kinetic energy, etc. This program was much more ambitious than the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty (ABM) Treaty 1972 that had sought to protect the command and control center of the US and the Soviet Union with anti-ballistic missile defense systems. The ABM had formally recognized the development and the deployment of defensive systems for one command and control center in each country. The SDI was aiming to protect the entire nation. The Soviets appeared to take the US program very seriously and felt that this the Americans were trying to regain the monopoly of the 1950s. The technological advances claimed by the proponents of the program did not materialize, and eventually the program was reduced in scope and size. Eventually, the SDI program was to lead the United States to develop the reactor missile defense system and the national missile defense system. The former defense system looked after the defense of specific geopolitical theaters like Western Europe, while the latter was to look to the defense of the mainland United States and Canada. Now let us have a look at the summary of the unit. More than half a century after the introduction of nuclear weapons, weapons which were supposed to make conventional war obsolete, conventional warfare continues to dominate the pattern of conflicts. In the context of two superpowers, nuclear weapons, however, did place limitations on the concept of total war that had been the feature of two great wars. This brought forward the concept of limited war. The unit also examined the place of conventional war in the nuclear age. As we saw, conventional warfare had evolved along with the technological changes. We have entered into the fourth generation warfare methods, where, unlike the earlier generations of warfare, the entire society is seen as a battlefield. In this phase, there is a decreased dependence on centralized logistics and use of linear and technological sophisticated armies. The objective of this warfare is on collapsing the enemy internally rather than defeating it in an all out war. We have also examined the thinking on nuclear weapons, particularly focusing on the concept of elements of nuclear strategy that made the peculiar situation of building up of a nuclear arsenal for its known use is reality. It should, however, be noted that despite the emergence of new nuclear weapon states and the spread of nuclear capability, nuclear strategies continue to debate on the methodology of use of nuclear weapons in times of war. The modern day sophistication that has come in the weapon system has meant that these weapons have a tactical use. One can predict the degree of destruction in terms of geographic limits to some certainty, yet one may not perhaps be able to quantify the subsequent ill effect of the bombing. What happens if deterrence fails? The fundamental dilemma of nuclear strategy remains that with the failure of deterrence, one may have to turn to conventional rather than nuclear weapons as the next option. In the next unit, we will focus on an entirely new pattern of warfare that has emerged in the post war era. This warfare is within the broad ambit of internal security and covers such types of wars like revolutionary wars, civil wars, insurgency, and the modern era asymmetric warfare of and on terrorism. Now we want to wind up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.